37 years of absolute rule ended not with a final address to the nation, not with a peaceful transition planned years in advance, but with a helicopter lifting a flag-draped coffin over a crowd so dense that the truck carrying it could no longer move. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had defined the Islamic Republic of Iran for nearly 4 decades, was buried before dawn in the city of his birth. The successor he supposedly left behind has not been seen, heard, or photographed by a single independent source since the war that killed his father began. This is the story of the day Iran finally laid its supreme leader to rest, and the deepening crisis of a regime that cannot produce proof its own chosen successor is even alive. It started on February the 28th, the opening day of a war that would eventually consume everything Khamenei had spent his life building. American and Israeli strikes hit his residence in Tehran directly, killing him along with 4 members of his own family in a single, devastating blow that decapitated the Islamic Republic's leadership in an instant. There was no lingering illness, no slow health decline the clerical establishment could quietly prepare the public for. There was a strike, and then there was a vacancy at the absolute center of Iranian political and religious power, filled within a week by a clerical assembly that proclaimed his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader of Iran. And from that moment forward, something deeply strange began unfolding in plain sight of the entire world. The man now supposedly commanding the Islamic Republic's nuclear program, its foreign policy, its military, and its clergy has not appeared in a single photograph, video, or audio recording since the day his father died. For nearly 4.5 months, Iran mourned a leader it could not properly bury while a war raged around it, until a ceasefire finally created enough of a window for the funeral to begin. What followed was 6 days of processions calculated down to the smallest detail, a state-funded spectacle moving Khamenei's body through Tehran, through the clerical seat of Qom, then across the border into Iraq to the Shia holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, before finally returning to Iranian soil for burial in Mashhad, the city of his birth and home to the shrine of Imam Reza, the single holiest site in Shia Islam anywhere on earth. Every stage of that 6-day journey was designed to project the same message outward. This regime is strong. This regime is unified. This regime commands the loyalty of millions. But watch closely as that message gets delivered, because underneath the choreography sits a government that cannot answer the single most basic question hanging over its own survival. Where is Mojtaba Khamenei? The clerical assembly proclaimed him supreme leader in early March. He has issued written statements bearing his name, and that is all. No image, no video, no audio recording. Senior sources inside Tehran have told international reporters that Mojtaba was severely wounded in the same February 28th strike that killed his father, left with debilitating injuries, a disfigured face, and badly damaged limbs. Whether he is even physically capable of appearing in public, whether the regime is concealing incapacitation, or whether something far more serious is being hidden entirely, no one outside the innermost circle of Iran's clerical and military establishment actually knows. And that uncertainty, sitting silently underneath 6 days of elaborate state-funded mourning, is the real story unfolding here, not the funeral of a dead leader, the disappearance of the man who is supposed to already be running the country in his place. Picture the scene in Mashhad on the final night. Khamenei's coffin, wrapped in the red, white, and green of the Iranian flag, moving by truck through streets packed so densely with mourners that the vehicle physically could not continue forward. Authorities were forced to deploy a helicopter simply to lift the coffin up and over the impenetrable crowd for the final short stretch toward the shrine's gilt dome and minarets. In the sweltering July heat, officials sprayed water hoses over the gathered masses just to keep people from collapsing where they stood. Black-clad mourners wept, waved Iranian flags, and held up photographs of the man they had come to bury. Somewhere in that same crowd, the physical absence of Mojtaba Khamenei, the man theoretically now responsible for every single decision this grieving nation would make going forward, became impossible to ignore. A government can stage a funeral of overwhelming scale and emotional weight. It cannot stage the presence of a man it either will not or cannot produce. Let's look at exactly who did show up, because the list of confirmed attendees tells its own story about where real power inside Iran now actually sits. Parliament Speaker and Chief Negotiator in the ongoing talks with the United States, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, stood present at the shrine. Iran's powerful Chief Justice, Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, was there. Khamenei's eldest son, Mostafa, led the funeral prayers himself, some senior figures reportedly weeping openly over the coffin as state television cameras rolled. Photographs circulated by IRGC-affiliated media claimed to show Quds Force Commander Esmail Khani in attendance during the Iraqi leg of the journey. Every single name on that list belongs to the existing power structure, the clergy, the parliament, the judiciary, the Revolutionary Guard. The one name missing is the only one that is supposed to matter most right now. Analysts studying the transition have been blunt about what that absence signals. describing the Revolutionary Guard as the dominant force now shaping Iran's political and strategic direction, the institution that effectively backed and installed Mojtaba's appointment in the first place, and the institution now filling the vacuum his continued invisibility has created. And this funeral did not happen in a moment of peace. It happened as fighting between Iran and the United States violently reignited after weeks of a fragile ceasefire, turning a solemn religious occasion into the backdrop for a fresh military escalation playing out in real time. On the very day of the burial, Iranian officials reported that renewed American strikes had killed 17 people. State media confirmed that one strike specifically targeted the railway line linking Tehran to Mashhad, roughly 55 kilometers from the city where Khamenei's funeral was being held, forcing the closure of that line and stranding passengers who had to be transferred onto buses instead. Think about the audacity embedded inside that single detail. The United States hit rail infrastructure tied directly to the funeral procession of the man it had already killed months earlier. A strike landing close enough to the burial itself that it could not possibly be read as coincidence. Iran's response came fast. Iran's army confirmed it had targeted a Patriot missile interceptor system in Kuwait, an early warning system in Qatar, and fuel storage tanks in Bahrain using drones, framing the strikes as retaliation against American bases scattered across the region. A U.S. defense official quickly countered that assessment, stating the dozens of missiles and drones Iran fired were either intercepted outright or caused no significant damage whatsoever, with 0 injuries reported among American personnel anywhere in the region. Sit with that exchange for a moment, because it captures the entire predicament Iran now finds itself trapped inside. On the day it buries its supreme leader, the day it most needs to project unshakable strength to its own population and to the wider world, its retaliatory strikes against 3 separate countries are being described by the opposing side as almost entirely ineffective. The optics of strength and the reality of military capability are pulling in 2 completely opposite directions, at exactly the moment Iran can least afford that gap to show. Here is where the fear becomes real, because a nation burying its supreme religious and political authority while simultaneously trading strikes with the world's most powerful military is a nation standing directly on top of a fault line. The crowds gathered in Mashhad were not simply mourning, they were furious, and that fury had a specific named target. Chants of "Death to America" and "Death to Israel" rang out above the mournful funeral laments and string music broadcast through loudspeakers across the shrine complex. Protesters carried signs reading "Kill Trump" through the streets, some shouting directly, "I swear by the blood of the Supreme Leader Trump, we will kill you." Iranian state media even organized a symbolic public execution and burning of a Trump-like effigy in Mashhad's Ahmadabad Square, the effigy mounted and paraded on a truck for the assembled crowds to witness. This is not simply grief. This is a regime deliberately channeling raw public anger toward an external enemy at the precise moment its own internal leadership structure sits shrouded in uncertainty. A classic and dangerous maneuver for any government trying to hold a fracturing population together through the sheer force of shared hatred rather than confidence in its own institutions. Because underneath all of that public fury sits a truth Iran's leadership desperately needs to keep buried alongside its former supreme leader. This funeral arrives not at the peak of the Islamic Republic's strength, but in the middle of its deepest internal crisis in decades. Khamenei's 37-year rule closes with its legacy bitterly disputed even inside Iran itself, a period his loyalists frame as decades of righteous resistance against foreign pressure, and a period his critics point to as one defined by repression, sustained economic hardship, and repeated waves of anti-government protest. The most recent wave, a nationwide uprising in January, ended with tens of thousands of protesters killed by Iran's own state security forces, a staggering number that speaks to just how violently this regime has already been forced to suppress its own population in order to survive to this point. Khamenei is being buried not as an uncontested icon, but as the architect of a system that a significant portion of his own citizens had, mere months earlier, been demanding an end to in the streets. Now layer the succession crisis directly on top of that instability. A government simultaneously managing a disputed legacy, a recent mass uprising, an active shooting war with the United States, and a supreme leader who cannot be produced in public as a government running on borrowed time and borrowed legitimacy. Every day that passes without a verified appearance from Iran leader is another day the vacuum around him deepens. Another day, the Revolutionary Guard's grip over actual decision-making tightens in his theoretical absence. And another day, ordinary Iranians are left to wonder whether they are being led by a wounded man recovering in secret, a figurehead entirely controlled by others, or something the regime has not yet found a way to explain to them at all. Now widen the lens to see how this domino effect spreads beyond Iran's own borders. This funeral did not just happen inside Iran. It happened across Iraq as well, moving through Najaf and Karbala, 2 of the holiest cities in Shia Islam, with Iranian state media presenting the Iraqi processions as a demonstration of regional solidarity, proof that Khamenei's authority reached well beyond Iran's own borders, even in death. IRGC-affiliated networks use the imagery deliberately, positioning it as evidence that Tehran's influence across the region remained intact, despite everything the war had already cost the country. But that same regional network, the alliance of armed groups and allied governments Iran has spent decades cultivating across Iraq, Lebanon, and beyond, now faces its own mounting pressure. As Tehran's central leadership sits weakened and unverified at exactly the moment its allies need clear direction the most. A network built around loyalty to a strong center does not hold together indefinitely once that center becomes this uncertain. And here is the wall of reality Iran's leadership has to face, whether they choose to say so publicly or not. International analysts, studying the overall balance of this war, point out something genuinely uncomfortable for Tehran's narrative of resilience. Iran has, in a narrow strategic sense, emerged from this latest military campaign having retained control of the vital Strait of Hormuz, the choke point this very channel has already covered in devastating detail as it pushed America's own oil reserves down to a 40-year low. That single fact lets Iran's state media claim a form of strategic survival. But that survival has come at a cost the country's own economy may not be able to absorb for years. Structural damage from months of sustained American and Israeli strikes has severely worsened an economic crisis that was already crushing ordinary Iranians well before this war began. Sanctions remain in place. Infrastructure lies damaged across multiple cities. And now, on top of all of that, the country enters a critical leadership transition without a supreme leader. Anyone outside a small circle of clerics and guard commanders has actually seen alive. This is the trap closing around Iran's regime from every direction at once. Show strength through a massive, tightly choreographed funeral, and you simultaneously advertise to the entire world exactly how fragile your succession really is. Retaliate against American bases to project resolve, and you invite an American official to publicly describe your strikes as largely ineffective on the very same day. Channel public fury toward Washington and toward a burning effigy in a public square. And you buy yourself a temporary release valve for anger that will eventually need somewhere real to go once the chanting stops, and the questions about Mojtaba's whereabouts do not. Every move available to Tehran's leadership right now solves one problem while deepening another. And the deepest problem of all, the identity, condition, and location of the man supposedly now in charge of the entire Islamic Republic, remains completely unresolved. Go back to that image from the Mashhad funeral, the helicopter lifting Khamenei's coffin over a crowd too dense to move through, the water hoses spraying down onto exhausted mourners in the July heat, the chants of vengeance rising up around a shrine built for peace and pilgrimage. Somewhere in that crowd, or perhaps nowhere near it at all, perhaps in a hospital room or a secure compound hundreds of miles away, sits the man this entire spectacle was supposedly building toward. A supreme leader the world has been told exists, but has never actually been allowed to see. Iran buried its old leader with overwhelming public ceremony precisely because it has no comparable proof of life for the new one. And until that changes, until Mojtaba Khamenei stands in front of a camera that the whole world can verify, this is not simply the funeral of Ali Khamenei. It is the opening chapter of a succession crisis Iran's regime cannot fully control and cannot afford to let drag on much longer. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and leave a comment so this analysis reaches more people who need to understand what just happened. We will continue tracking this crisis as it develops.